The Dravari war table was not a dramatic place. It was a long gray room with no windows, and the light inside it was the color of old teeth. Voketh stood at the head of it and pointed at a small blue dot on the holographic map. "That one," he said. Nobody argued. That was how unremarkable it was. The planet was third from a yellow star in an outer arm of the galaxy. It was small. It had one moon. Its inhabitants were biological, carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, divided among themselves into hundreds of small political groups that had spent most of their history fighting each other. They had only recently stopped pointing their weapons inward. They had not yet started pointing them outward. Voketh pulled up the summary file. He read through it the way a man reads a grocery list. The species called itself human. It had been producing radio signals for a little over 100 years. Its most advanced spacecraft had not left its own solar system. Its biggest weapons were nuclear, old technology, the kind of thing the Dravari had moved past 4 centuries ago. He closed the file. "We will need a logistics depot in that system," he said. "The third planet is the most suitable. Atmospheric adjustment will take time, but the land mass is adequate." One of his aides asked about the current inhabitants. Voketh picked up his stylus. "Relocate or displace. Standard protocol." He moved on to the next item on the agenda. That was the whole conversation about Earth. 3 days later, Voketh sent letters to 4 other empires. He was not excited about sending them. He would have preferred to claim the planet outright, but the logistics were complicated. The Dravari did not have the fleet numbers to hold a new acquisition while managing 2 existing conflicts at the outer edges of their territory. The Aun Collective responded first. They were always fast. They communicated not in words but in something closer to harmonized data pulses. The translation software rendered it as text, but the feeling was always of something slightly too large for the sentence it sat in. They agreed to the coalition. They wanted mineral rights to 2 of the outer moons. The Pethani sovereignty agreed next. They wanted resettlement priority on the northern continent. The Kurath were last. They agreed to everything and asked for nothing specific, which Voketh noted in a small file he kept for himself. Entities that asked for nothing specific always had a specific thing in mind. The coalition was formed in 11 days. The paperwork was filed. The fleet coordinates were shared. The plan was simple: move in formation, broadcast the standard surrender demand, give the humans a window to comply, process the outcome. Voketh had done this 23 times with 23 different species. It was, by his estimation, the least interesting part of the job. On Earth, in a building in Colorado that had no sign on the door, Connor Walsh was staring at something that should not exist. He had been a signal analyst for 19 years. He had sat in front of screens that showed him deep space telemetry for so long that the patterns were as familiar as his own handwriting. He knew what background noise looked like. He knew what natural pulses looked like. He knew what human-made interference looked like. He did not know what this looked like. It was subtle. That was the first thing. Something that was not quite a reflection and not quite an echo was bouncing off the telemetry at a specific angle, at a specific interval, with a regularity that was not natural. It had been there for weeks, possibly longer, hiding in the data the way a splinter hides under skin, present, invisible, making itself known only when you pressed exactly the right spot. Connor sat with it for 40 minutes. Then he opened a blank document and typed 4 words. "We are being surveilled." He did not call anyone. He did not send the document. He sat there and finished his coffee, which had gone cold, and stared at the screen. Then he started pulling files. Not defense files. Not weapons assessments. Not threat response protocols. History files. Every major conflict in the human record. Every siege. Every campaign. Every moment when a smaller force had faced a larger one and found a way through. He read through them the way a mechanic reads through a repair manual, looking for the pattern underneath the pattern, looking for the thing that kept repeating. He stayed in the building that night. He did not call home. After 19 years, the people who mattered already knew what it meant when he did not call. Over the next 18 months, Connor built something. He did not do it alone. He brought in 3 people he trusted, one of whom was a woman named Abby Stone who could decode a signal faster than anyone he had ever met and who had a habit of saying exactly what she meant, which was rarer than it should have been. He brought in Pete Harlow, a comms engineer from Tucson who was 28 years old and not yet old enough to be properly afraid of things he should be afraid of. Pete had good instincts and a retractable ballpoint pen he clicked when he was thinking. He clicked it a lot. He brought in one other person whose name the files would later keep private. Together, they mapped the surveillance. They identified every observation point in the solar system that did not belong to any human organization. They tracked the signals going in and out. They decoded enough to understand the shape of what was coming, not the specifics, not yet, but the shape. Multiple sources. Multiple directions. Organized. They built a response. Not a weapons response. Not a defense shield. Something else, something that took longer, that required more patience than any of them were naturally comfortable with, that required sitting on information that would have started a global panic if it had leaked. None of it leaked. Connor had chosen his 3 people correctly. Voketh finalized the coalition fleet formation in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes. He assigned approach paths. He reviewed the broadcast template for the surrender demand. He approved the timeline. He looked, one more time, at the summary file on the humans. 100 years of radio signals. Internal conflicts. No travel beyond their own solar system. No known weapons beyond the nuclear level. He felt nothing in particular about them. That was the thing he would later spend a great deal of time thinking about. He had looked at the file. He had read the numbers. He had processed the information about a species that had spent a century broadcasting its entire history into space, every war, every disaster, every moment of desperation and stubborn survival, and he had felt nothing in particular. He closed the file. In Colorado, in a building with no sign on the door, Connor Walsh was finishing something. He sat back in his chair and looked at what they had built over 18 months and did not say anything for a long time. Pete clicked his pen. "Is it ready?" Pete asked. Connor picked up his coffee. Cold again. He drank it anyway. "It's ready," he said. He did not say anything else. Pete did not ask him to. That was one of the things Connor liked about Pete. Outside, it was a regular Tuesday. Cars were moving on the highway. Somewhere a dog was barking. The sky was the normal color of sky. None of the people driving those cars, none of the people walking their dogs, none of the people going about the ordinary business of an ordinary Tuesday, knew that 4 alien empires had already decided what to do with their planet. They also did not know what Connor had spent 18 months building for exactly this reason. The second thing was, on balance, more important. The ultimatum came on a Thursday. It arrived on every frequency at once: radio, microwave, light pulse, and 2 bands that human instruments had never used but could detect if properly tuned, which they now were. The signal was strong enough to reach every continent without amplification. It was, in technical terms, the loudest thing anyone had ever heard from space. Abby Stone decoded it in 11 minutes. She had been prepared. She printed 1 copy, walked it to Lena Marsh's office, set it on the desk, and stepped back. Lena Marsh was 58 years old. She had grown up on a cattle ranch in Montana, had spent her 20s in military intelligence, her 30s in government work nobody talked about at dinner parties, and her 50s running the Unified Response Directorate, the organization that officially did not exist and unofficially had been preparing for this exact moment. She read the ultimatum twice. It was calm, formal, and very clear. 4 empires. Combined fleet strength listed in figures that translated to numbers no human military planner had ever seriously modeled against. A window of 72 hours to broadcast a formal surrender. A list of compliance terms. A note, at the bottom, that non-compliance would be treated as a decision to resist, and that the consequences of resistance had been calculated and found to be total. Lena set the paper down. "Pete," she said, to the man standing in the doorway with a pen in his hand, "put on a pot of coffee." Real coffee. Pete went to put on coffee. Lena picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The third one was to Cal Briggs, who was an admiral and a man of very few words. She told him what had arrived. He said one thing. She agreed with it. They hung up. Then she walked down the hall to the room where Connor Walsh was already sitting in front of his screen. He had read the transmission before she had. He had been expecting it. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting, and he did not look up when she came in. Timeline, she asked. We use the full 72 hours, he said. Not 69. Not 73. 72 exactly. Because it tells them we read the terms carefully. That we are not panicking. And that we are choosing the time of our response, not reacting to theirs. Lena pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down. And what are we sending them, she said. Connor looked up for the first time. Something they have never received before, he said. Voketh waited. He had expected a response within the first 12 hours. Most species broke inside 12 hours. The weight of the numbers, the fleet strength, the combined military capacity of 4 empires, was designed to do that. It was a calibrated weight. Voketh had watched it work on species that were technically more advanced than humans. Hour 12 passed. Nothing. He reviewed the broadcast logs to confirm the signal had been received. It had. Every Earth frequency showed the reception clearly. The humans had heard it. Hour 24. Nothing. Voketh pulled up the human history files again. He had read the summaries. Now he read deeper. There was a category of conflict he kept returning to. It did not have a clean word in the Dravari language. It was the pattern of a group that had lost, had been clearly, measurably, statistically beaten, and then simply did not stop. Not because they had a new plan. Not because they had new resources. Apparently, sometimes, just because they had decided not to stop. He found 73 documented examples of this pattern in the human record. He closed the file. He told himself this was not relevant. Humans had no interstellar fleet. Humans had no weapons beyond the nuclear level. Humans could not reach the coalition ships even if they wanted to. Whatever they did within their own atmosphere was, in practical terms, meaningless. He told himself this until hour 36. At hour 36 he noticed he was telling himself things, which was not something he normally did. He stopped. In the building with no sign on the door, nobody slept. Pete Harlow had made 9 pots of coffee by the end of the first day. He had also worn the clip on his pen down to a rough edge from clicking it. He monitored incoming signals, outgoing telemetry, coalition fleet movements, and 4 other data feeds at the same time, and he did it without being asked twice about anything, which was the best thing Connor could say about working with a 28-year-old who had never done anything like this before. Around hour 40, Pete looked up from his screen. They are nervous, he said. Connor did not look up. How do you know? The Aun Collective has sent 3 internal signals in the last 6 hours. They are usually quiet between communications. 3 is a lot for them. Connor wrote something on his legal pad. Pete clicked his pen. Then he asked the thing he had been not asking for 40 hours. Are we going to be okay? Connor put his pen down on the legal pad. He picked up his coffee. He set it back down without drinking. We are going to be exactly what we need to be, he said. Pete waited for the rest of that sentence. It did not come. He clicked his pen and went back to his screen. Hour 48. Voketh was doing something he had not done in a long time. He was second-guessing. Not the coalition was sound. Not the fleet positioning, that was precise. Not the surrender terms, those were standard. He was second-guessing the summary file. He had read it. He had processed the numbers. He had categorized the humans as pre-interstellar, low threat, non-priority except as a resource acquisition. He had done everything the way he always did it. But the silence was not what silence usually sounded like. Most species, in the gap between receiving a surrender demand and responding to it, produced noise. Emergency broadcasts. Leadership communications. Public signals full of fear and confusion. The frequency bands went loud with the sounds of a civilization trying to figure out what to do. Earth's frequency bands were quiet. Not silent, there was still ordinary traffic, entertainment signals, civilian communications. The background sound of a civilization going about its day. That was the part that was wrong. Voketh had delivered surrender demands to 19 species. All 19 had gone loud. Earth had gone quiet. Not panicked quiet. Not collapsed quiet. Quiet the way something goes quiet when it is concentrating. At hour 71, he called a briefing with his senior staff. He stood at the head of the long gray table and looked at the data, and he said nothing for longer than was comfortable. Whatever they send us, he said finally, read it completely before you bring it to me. His staff nodded. They did not ask why. He was glad they did not ask why, because he was not certain he had an answer that would have helped them. Hour 72. Earth's signal went out on every frequency at once. It was not a voice message. It was not a video. It was a file. Abby Stone watched the transmission move outward into deep space and said nothing for a while. Then she said, to nobody in particular, that ought to do it. Pete was standing behind her. He was clicking his pen very slowly now, one click every few seconds, like a hand on a clock. What did we just send them? He asked. Abby looked at him. The truth, she said. Voketh opened the file. He had expected a document. He had not expected this kind of document. The first page had no greeting, no formal diplomatic language, no introduction of any kind. It began, simply, with coordinates. A long list of them. Each one had a label beside it. He recognized the first set immediately. They were the coordinates of Dravari Fleet Group 7, currently positioned at the edge of the Sol system in a holding formation. The coordinates were accurate to within 6 standard hours. That meant the humans had been tracking the fleet's position in real time and had updated the file less than a day before sending it. He read further. Fleet Group 3. The outer depot at Velsaruth. The secondary refueling point at Keth Minor, which had only been built 14 weeks ago and which had been kept at the highest level of Dravari secrecy. The humans had its coordinates. Voketh did not move for a while. He sat at his desk and looked at the screen and made himself read every line, because the professional part of him knew that how he read this would affect how he thought about it. He read every line. There were 42 pages on the Dravari alone. Then the Pethani section began. The Aun Collective received their section at the same moment. The chorus of Aun did not process information the way individual species did. They experienced data as a group, every member of the collective receiving the same input at exactly the same time. It was, in theory, the most efficient possible way to take in information. On this occasion it meant that every single member of the chorus of Aun learned the same thing at once. The file contained a complete record of every Aun observation post in the Sol system. Not a partial record. Not a summary. Every post, with installation dates, signal logs, and technical details. The oldest post had been installed 91 years ago. At the bottom of that entry, in a small notation field, were 4 words written in the Aun harmonic language, translated so precisely that it used a dialect form the Aun had not used in formal communication for 60 years. The 4 words said, "We found this immediately." The chorus of Aun went completely silent. Not the silence of processing. The silence of something that has just been told a truth it was not ready for. They had placed that observation post 91 years ago. They had watched humanity through it for 91 years. They had decided, 91 years ago, that humanity was not aware of being watched. Earth had found the post. Earth had left it running. For 91 years, Earth had known there was an Aun observation post sitting in its solar system, and had left it running, and had said nothing, and had been watching the watchers watch them. The chorus of Aun stayed silent for 7 hours. Pete Harlow was monitoring the response signals when the Aun went quiet. He almost missed it because quiet was what he was not watching for. He was watching for panic, for fleet movement, for the sound of a coalition falling apart. Silence read as nothing on most monitors. But Pete had been watching the Aun feed specifically, because Connor had told him to, and when the signal traffic dropped to 0 he caught it. He stared at his screen. Then he got up, walked to Connor's office, and stood in the doorway. Connor was reading something on his own screen. He did not look up. The Aun went quiet, Pete said. I know, Connor said. How long will they stay that way? However long it takes, Connor said. Sit down. Pete sat in the chair across from Connor's desk. He clicked his pen. What did we put in their section that did that? Pete asked. Connor looked up then. He looked at Pete for a moment the way a person looks at someone who has asked a fair question with a complicated answer. The truth, Connor said. Pete recognized those as Abby's words. He did not say so. Voketh reached the end of the Dravari pages. He had read all 42. He had checked them against his own classified records and confirmed that the accuracy was total. Not approximate. Not mostly correct with some errors. Total. Fleet positions, depot locations, political fault lines within the outer territories, the names of 3 Dravari officials who had been conducting private negotiations with the Pedhani, negotiations that even the Dravari High Council did not officially know about. The humans knew about them. He moved to the Pedhani section and kept reading. Not because he needed the intelligence for himself. He read it because he needed to understand how deep the file went. It went very deep. The Kurath section was the shortest. It was still 40 pages. At the end of the Kurath section there was a paragraph that was not a list of coordinates or a record of secret operations. It was, as far as Voketh could tell, an assessment, a profile of the Kurath commander currently in charge of the coalition's forward ships. The commander was identified by name. His decision-making habits under pressure were described over 3 paragraphs. The document noted that he had a history of choosing escalation when faced with uncertainty, that he had done this in 4 previous situations, and that the pattern suggested he would do it again. The document also listed the estimated window in which this would happen. Voketh sat with that for a long time. Then he turned to the final page. He had expected more data on the final page. There was no data on the final page. There was one sentence, written in Old Dravari, not modern Dravari, not the formal Dravari used in diplomatic communication, but the dialect of the Unification Wars, 2 centuries old. It was the language used between a victor and the civilization that had just come to understand what it had lost. Voketh had studied that period of Dravari history. He knew the dialect well. He read the sentence. Then he read it again. Then he closed the file and sat very still in his gray room with no windows, under the light that was the color of old teeth, for a long time. His aide knocked on the door. He did not answer. The sentence was not a threat. It was not a demand. It contained no weapons list, no statement of military capability, no ultimatum of any kind. It said, "We have been your neighbors for 100 years. We were hoping you would introduce yourselves eventually." In the dialect of the Unification Wars, the word for neighbors carried a specific second meaning. It was the word a civilization used to describe the entity beside it, the one that had been watching, had chosen not to act first, and had been patient enough to let the other party move. In that dialect, it was also the word for the one who was ready first. Voketh did not share the contents of the final page with his council that night. He needed to think about it. He thought about it for a long time. Back in Colorado, in the room that smelled like old coffee and recycled air, Pete Harlow was watching his board and not saying much. The Pedhani signals had gone strange, shorter, more frequent, coded differently than before. The Kurath signals had slowed almost to nothing, which Pete had learned by now was not the same as quiet. The Aun were still silent. Connor walked through the room at some point in the evening, stopped behind Pete's chair, looked at the board, and then kept walking without saying anything. Pete clicked his pen. He thought about the fact that somewhere out there, right now, the people reading that file were sitting in their own equivalent of a gray room with bad lighting, looking at information they had not expected, and feeling the specific feeling that came from realizing you had looked at something and missed what it actually was. He thought about what it meant to be the thing they had missed. He clicked his pen one more time. Then he went back to watching. The coalition lasted 40 hours after the transmission before it started coming apart. It did not come apart loudly. There was no formal declaration, no emergency meeting, no broadcast saying the agreement was over. It came apart the way agreements come apart when nobody trusts anyone, quietly, in back channels, in small careful messages sent between parties who were all trying to figure out what everyone else was planning before deciding what they were planning. The Pedhani contacted the Kurath first. The message was short and did not say directly what it meant. It asked, in diplomatic language, whether the Kurath had fully assessed the implications of the received file, and whether they had updated their position accordingly. The Kurath responded that they had reviewed the file and were continuing to evaluate all options. Neither of these messages said anything concrete. Both of them said the same thing: we are not sure what the others are going to do, and we are not committing to anything until we know. Voketh intercepted both messages within the hour. He kept them in a private folder on his desk. He was not ready to have that conversation with his council yet. He was still thinking about the last page. In the building with no sign on the door, Lena Marsh was standing behind Pete Harlow watching the board. Pete had 11 signal feeds open. His pen was in his shirt pocket now. He had stopped clicking it about an hour ago, which was, in its own way, harder to be around than the clicking had been. The pet honey reached out to the Kurath, Pete said. Encrypted, but we can read it. What did they say? Lena asked. Nothing specific. But the shape of nothing says they are scared. Lena nodded slowly. The Aun. Still quiet on coalition channels. They are talking to each other internally, but we cannot read that. Lena looked at the board for a long moment. How long until one of them does something they will regret? She asked. Pete reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder he had not made himself. Someone else had prepared it. The name on the tab was not one Pete recognized, which meant it came from the part of the building he did not have clearance for. He opened it and read the first page. The Kurath commander, Pete said. 48 hours. Maybe less. Lena put one hand briefly on Pete's shoulder. Then she walked away down the hall without saying anything else. Pete looked at the folder in his hands. The Kurath commander was named in it. His history was laid out in 4 clean paragraphs. 4 previous situations. 4 times he had chosen to push forward when he was uncertain. Each time, pushing forward had not worked in his favor. Each time, he had done it anyway. Pete put the folder down and went back to his screen. He did not click his pen. The Kurath commander's name was Deathvaughn, and he was not a foolish man. He had read the file. He had read his own section, 40 pages of precise, detailed, accurate information about Kurath fleet positions and operations that a species with no interstellar travel had apparently put together without his knowledge. He had read the assessment of his own decision-making at the end of the section, which was the part that had made him set the file down and walk away from his desk for a while. He understood what the file was designed to do. It was designed to make him stop. To make him cautious. To tell him that Earth knew things, and that acting against Earth was acting against something that knew things, and that information on its own was a kind of power even without ships or weapons to back it up. He understood this clearly. He also understood that he was the forward element commander of a 4-empire coalition, and that if he pulled back now, if he allowed a planet with no interstellar fleet to send one document and watch the entire coalition dissolve, the conversation that would follow back on Kurath territory would be a very difficult one to survive professionally. He thought about this for 31 hours. Then he made a decision. 3 destroyers separated from the main formation. The official orders logged them as a reconnaissance and assessment unit. The word that was not in the orders was the word that everyone in the command room understood without needing to hear it. Deathvaughn watched the 3 ships go. He was not certain this was the right choice. He was certain it was the one he was going to make. In the building with no sign on the door, Pete Harlow's board showed the Kurath formation change at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning. 3 signals broke from the main cluster. Changed direction. Started moving. Pete stared at the screen. Then he got up, walked down a hall he had never walked this late before, and knocked on a door he had never knocked on. Sir, he said through the door, the Kurath have moved 3 ships. A pause. Be right there, said Cal Briggs. Cal Briggs arrived in Pete's monitoring room in under 2 minutes, which meant he had already been awake. He stood at the screen and looked at the 3 signals and their heading. He did not say anything for about 30 seconds. Then he said 4 words to Pete. Pete heard them. He would not repeat them to anyone, not because he was told not to, but because they felt, in some way he could not explain, like they were not his words to carry. He sat back down. Cal Briggs left the room. 16 minutes later, Pete's board went quiet in one specific sector. Not the whole board. Just that part. The 3 signals that had broken from the Kurath formation were no longer on the screen. Pete looked at the empty space where they had been. He looked at it for a while. Then he said, very quietly, to nobody in the room in particular, "Oh." He put his hand in his shirt pocket. Found his pen. Took it out. The clip had been fully broken off since somewhere around hour 68. It was just a smooth cylinder now. Still worked perfectly. He put it back in his pocket. Around him, the other people in the room were returning to their stations without any conversation. The coffee machine was running somewhere down the hall. Outside, far away, there was the sound of a car on the highway. The sector on Pete's board stayed empty. He went back to watching the other feeds. Voketh received the report on the Kurath movement, and the report on the silence that followed it, at the same time. He sat with both of them. He had read the assessment of the Kurath commander's decision-making. He had not passed it on to Death Vaughn. He had kept it. He was not certain, now, how he felt about that choice. He pulled up the Earth file one more time. He went to the last page. He read the sentence again, in the old dialect, with all the weight the dialect carried. "We have been your neighbors for 100 years. We were hoping you would introduce yourselves eventually." The thing that would not leave him, the thing he kept returning to, was not the word neighbors, with all its layered meaning. It was not the precision of the dialect choice. It was the word hoping. Not warning. Not demanding. Not threatening. Hoping. A species that had been watching 4 empires organize against them, that had spent 18 months building a file more complete than anything in his intelligence archive, that had apparently known about alien observation posts in their system for nearly a century and had chosen to say nothing about it, that species had looked at all of this and used the word hoping. Voketh did not know what kind of thing used that word in that position. He was beginning to understand that he needed to find out. Voketh came to Earth alone. He filed it with his council as a diplomatic clarification mission, which was a phrase that could mean almost anything and in this case meant, he was going, and he did not want to explain why yet. He landed at a facility that was large and functional and had no particular statement to make about itself. He had expected something built to impress, the kind of architecture designed to make a visitor feel small, with tall ceilings and long empty corridors and the specific silence that power uses to announce itself. The Dravari built their diplomatic centers that way. Most empires did. What he got was a lobby with medium ceilings and a woman behind a desk who told him someone would be right with him. He waited. Lena Marsh arrived in under 5 minutes. She was shorter than the intelligence files had suggested. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away, not because it was trained to be still, but because stillness was simply her natural condition. She looked at him the way a person looks at a new piece of land they are considering, not hostile, not warm, but taking it in. "Come on back," she said. He followed her down a plain hallway and into a conference room with a long table, chairs, a window that looked out at a parking lot, and a coffee pot on a side table. Lena poured 2 cups and set one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He looked at the cup. He had read about coffee in the human files. He picked it up and tried it. It was unlike anything in his experience. He did not have words for it in Dravari. He set the cup down and made a note to find words later. Lena was already watching him. "You came a long way," she said. "Yes," he said. "That means you have questions." "Yes," he said again. She nodded once, slowly. "Okay." They talked for 4 hours. Voketh had prepared a list of things to cover. He did not get through the list, because conversations do not follow the shape a list assumes, and this one moved in directions he had not planned for. He had expected a negotiation, the formal language of 2 parties setting the terms of how things would work going forward. What he got was something harder to name. Lena Marsh talked the way a river moves around a rock. The most important part of what she meant was always slightly to the side of what she said, and by the time you noticed the gap, she had already moved on. He asked her how long Earth had known about the coalition's formation. She picked up her coffee cup. "You read our file," she said. "What did you take from it?" He noted the non-answer. He moved on. He asked her what the Kurath sector going quiet meant for the future of how the empires and Earth would relate to each other. She set her cup down. "That is a Kurath question," she said. "Not ours." He asked about Earth's capabilities, not the intelligence capabilities, which the file had shown in full, but the other kind. The kind that had made a sector go quiet in 16 minutes. She looked at him for a moment. What a specific question, she said. He let that go as well. What he came to understand, across those 4 hours, was that Lena Marsh was not being difficult for the sake of it. She was not keeping things back to seem powerful or to play at strategy. She was the kind of person who believed that the most important thing you had was the thing you did not offer, and that what you chose to give and what you chose to keep was itself a form of communication. That the shape of the silence told you more than the words did. She was, in that way, the most Dravari-minded human he had ever encountered. He did not say this to her. He had the feeling she would have found it funny, which was its own kind of unsettling. Connor Walsh was in a room 3 floors below the conference room, doing something quiet. He was archiving the files, the full record of 18 months of work. Every piece of intelligence. Every decoded signal. Every observation post record. Every fleet position. The assessment documents. The transmission itself. All of it needed to be organized properly, labeled correctly, stored in a way that would be useful to the people who came after. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, without going back to redo things, getting it right the first time. At some point in the afternoon he found, in a folder from 18 months earlier, a document he had written to himself on the night he first found the surveillance signal in the telemetry. He had not looked at it since. It was 4 sentences long. He read them. He did not sit with it the way another person might have sat with it, thinking about the distance between that night and this afternoon, about everything that had happened in between, about the weight of it. That was not how Connor thought. What was in front of him was an archive that needed finishing. He put the document back in its correct place and kept working. He finished the archive before dinner. Voketha's transport left Earth's atmosphere at dusk, local time. He sat in the forward cabin and looked at nothing in particular as the planet shrank behind him. The sentence from the last page of the file had lived in the back of his mind since he first read it. Now, with the conversation with Lena Marsh sitting beside it, it had moved to the front. We have been your neighbors for 100 years. We were hoping you would introduce yourselves eventually. He had spent weeks thinking about the content of the sentence. Now he was thinking about the dialect choice. The humans had written to him in the language of the Unification Wars, the dialect used between a victor and the civilization that had just come to understand what it had lost. They had access to every other register of Dravari language. The file had been translated precisely enough to prove it. They had looked at every available option and chosen that one. Not to threaten. Not to boast. To communicate something more precise than either. A species that had found an alien observation post and left it running for 91 years. That had spent a century broadcasting its entire history into space, every war, every failure, every time it had been broken and gotten back up, without trying to hide any of it. That had received a surrender demand from 4 empires and responded with a document instead of a plea. That had watched a Kurath sector go quiet in 16 minutes and returned, the following morning, to ordinary business. That species had looked at all of this and used the word hoping. Not the word of something preparing for a fight. The word of something that had been patient for a very long time and would go on being patient, because patience was simply what it was. Voketh looked out the window at Earth, small now, ordinary looking, blue. He thought about what kind of species used that word in that position. He did not come to a clean conclusion. He thought that was probably the point. Pete Harlow was at his station when the ship tracking showed Voketha's transport clearing the outer atmosphere. The board was quieter than it had been in months. The coalition ships had repositioned, farther back, no longer arranged in any formation that looked like an approach. The Aun had resumed normal communication traffic, but it was slower and more deliberate than before. The Pethani had sent a formal request for a follow-up diplomatic channel. The Kurath had sent nothing, which was expected and would likely stay that way for some time. Pete watched the board. After a while he reached into his shirt pocket and took out his pen. The clip had broken off weeks ago. It was just a cylinder now, smooth on the outside, still writing perfectly. He clicked it once. Put it back. Outside the window, the sky was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, going orange at the edges, the sun going down, the first stars starting to show through. Pete had been doing this job for 3 years. He had spent most of those 3 years watching signals that meant nothing, processing data that went nowhere, waiting for the thing that his instincts had been quietly telling him was eventually going to arrive. It had arrived. He had sat through it with his pen and his coffee and his 11 pots worth of bad sleep, and he had watched a sector go empty in 16 minutes, and he had said, "Oh," to a room that was not really listening. He was 28 years old. He sat with the sky for a while. Then the board showed a new signal, routine, civilian, just ordinary traffic, and he turned back to his screen and logged it. The ordinary business of a regular day. The ordinary business of being the kind of species that had kept the lights on for 100 years, and watched, and waited, and written one word on the last page of a file that had terrified every empire that read it. Not a weapon. Not a warning. Just a word. Hoping. Pete clicked his pen in his pocket without taking it out. The sky went dark. He kept watching.